we are really delighted to have Deborah Raji joining us here today to talk about facial recognition, surveillance and policing, and video surveillance, excuse me, and policing. You all have likely seen Deb's bio on our website, but in the interest of giving you a little summary of her background, I'm also going to read to you from that at the moment. So Deb is a Mozilla Fellow and Computer Science PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley, who is interested in questions on algorithmic auditing and evaluation. In the past, she has worked closely with the Algorithmic Justice League to highlight bias in deployed AI products, and has also worked with Google's ethical AI team and been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and the AI Now Institute at New York University, working on projects to operationalize ethical consideration in machine learning engineering practice. Recently, she was named to Forbes 30 Under 30. She was also named in the MIT Tech Review 35 Under 35 Innovators and to the Time 100 AI. Deb, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and apologies about my technical difficulties.
No problem. So glad that you're able to be here.
Yeah, very glad I was able to make it.
Yes, us too. So folks, just to give an introduction for how the program works, we're going to go through, kind of a series of questions that I prepared in advance, and then we'll open it up for questions from the assembled crowd as well. And folks know this is being recorded, and we also like to make sure we have an interactive experience as we go. So if people have resources to drop in the chat, or if there are things that you shout out, I will try to drop those in the chat as we go. And let's dig into some of your research and work. So I figured we could maybe start with some kind of background on how you got involved in the field, and in particular, working on algorithmic accountability at the intersection of kind of facial recognition technology, AI, policing, and racism. And you did some really impactful work back in 2019 on the Gender Shades project. So I wondered if you could give us kind of an introduction about what that project was about, and its major findings, and kind of how that work revealed how facial recognition technology developed with embedded racial and gender bias within the algorithms.
Yeah, so my journey actually started, I studied robotics engineering for my undergrad, and I got really into computer vision. So sort of like leveraging computers to sort of understand visual media. And from there, I ended up working at a machine learning startup that was focused on computer vision. And I was sort of on the builder side of it. I was building, I was on an applied machine learning team and trying to build various models, including one sort of facial analysis tool. And that was the first time where I saw these data sets and noticed that, there weren't a lot of faces that look like mine. And it kind of shocked me. And I remember having a conversation with my manager at the time. So this is like 2017. Yeah, at the time it was very much normalized in the computer vision field to not consider some of these like socio-technical considerations. And so when I brought it up to my manager at the time, it was very much like, oh, yeah, I guess that we don't have really good representation in our benchmarks and our data sets in this field. But it's so hard to get data that we can't really think about this. And it was very much dismissed. And so at the time, though, like sort of one person really thinking about this was Joy Buolamwini at the MIT Media Lab. And she had already given a TED Talk at that point on and now she has a book called Unmasking AI that goes into detail of this moment. But she had given a TED Talk about how facial recognition systems didn't really work for her face, and how she had sort of started putting on like a white mask in order to be detected with her use of facial recognition for research purposes. And so that led her to kind of initiate the Gender Shades project, where she looked at commercially deployed facial recognition products from IBM, Microsoft, and Face++. And again, at the time, ACLU was reporting that these were commercial products that were being pitched to police departments, pitched to immigration agencies. And what she had discovered with Timnit Gebru, and at the time I was just like interning with them. I was helping them with data cleaning and things like that. And what we had discovered effectively was that these deployed products were not working very well for darker skinned female faces, as compared to the performance, which was almost at 100% for lighter skinned male faces. And so this was really shocking, mostly because the performance on the darker skinned female faces were like less than 70% accuracy on the facial analysis task being analyzed. And that was really, far below what was acceptable for a deployed product, especially a product that was being pitched to be used in really high stakes scenarios like policing and immigration. And so it kind of disrupted the narrative at the time, which was that, oh, facial recognition is incredibly functional. And so we shouldn't even be, it's just a question of pros and cons of, the other ethical considerations around the use of this technology. And so I think it really brought into focus of, wait, actually, this might not be an appropriate technology to use in any high stakes scenario. It's not mature enough, but also it clearly is not being adequately vetted and evaluated, that they're sort of missing the community has sort of missed this huge gap of performance on this particular impacted population. So I thought that was really compelling. And about a year later, we did a follow-up study where we audited additional facial recognition products in the same field, in the same industry. So we audited Amazon, which again was at the time pitching their product to police and immigration. And then we audited Kairos, which was a facial recognition startup company. And then we found that there were sort of still consistent biased performance outcomes for darker skinned women versus lighter skinned men on these companies that hadn't been named in the initial audit. Meanwhile, the companies that we had audited in 2018, about 7 months later, each of these 3 companies had re-released their models, and they had drastically improved performance for the darker female subgroup, but there were still gaps between the performance on that subgroup relative to the lighter male subgroup. And then later, NIST sort of cited our 2019 follow-up study in their decision to directly kind of evaluate for demographic effects for facial recognition vendors. And they found that for a lot of these like mainstream facial recognition tools, performance was, up to, 100 times worse for minority faces than otherwise. And that also has really launched a whole investigation within the computer science field around thinking through some of these demographic differences in performance and model performance. And I think the biggest takeaway for us was when a lot of, especially in 2020 with George Floyd and a lot of the discussion around the use of these surveillance tools in policing, this ended up being a really critical piece of evidence in a lot of the discourse around, why we allow the use of facial recognition in these high stakes settings, if it's even reliable technology. In addition to sort of the privacy and surveillance concerns, there was just this additional dimension of like, is it even worth it? Like, is the pro in this pro-con analysis even there? And that led to the sort of voluntary moratorium that a lot of these companies put out, where they effectively paused or stopped completely their sale of this technology to police departments. And at the same time, I would say like that summer of 2019 into 2020, there was a wave of sort of bills, facial recognition bans and municipal bills sort of pushing for moratoriums, and an attempt at a facial recognition privacy act at the federal level, but we haven't seen that followed through on yet. There's like 20 Amazon lobbyists for every one of us, but we're still sort of pushing on the policy front to make it an industry-wide expectation that, you have to think about the impacts on these marginalized communities when you release this type of technology.
That was such a helpful overview, and I think really amazing to bridge the kind of technical side of things with the policy side of things, and that's precisely what we're trying to do today. So, I want to get into some of the work you've done since about kind of auditing and accountability structures around this, and then we'll come back to the kind of moratorium and sort of how things have shifted on the policy side. But in a more recent paper that you authored, you surveyed more than 100 face data sets, right, representing like more than 150 million images, to understand how this technology has evolved over the last few decades and where kind of the speed of its evolution has resulted in deteriorating guardrails or kind of inconsistent transparency. So I'm wondering, kind of what were your key takeaways from that project about data set evaluation, and what are the kinds of policies internally within the kind of proprietary software, right, that across the field might yield better transparency and accountability?
Yeah, so the Saving Face project, or sorry, no, this is about Face project, was really initiated by a conversation, and it's still an ongoing conversation. I've also worked on another sort of related project called Data and Its Discontents, where we sort of talk about broader data practices within the machine learning field. But with face data, it's biometric data, which is in certain cases, with BIPA, we have legal protections on that kind of data. But the way it was being handled by the machine learning community, especially the computer vision community, those that were developing these facial recognition tools, was completely sort of disproportionate to the sensitivity of what face data is. And so what we found was that historically, because we were wondering why are we so careless with this data? And our conclusion was really interesting. So one is that face data is sort of unique in that with fingerprints or other biometric data, there's sort of a awareness or consciousness to how you sort of contribute that data into a network or an ecosystem of or a database. Whereas with face data, it can be captured remotely, it can be captured very easily without consent. And also we upload our face data to the internet, to social media profiles. And that's just a dynamic that doesn't exist for other types of biometric data. And it leads to some of the practices that we currently see in how this data is managed, distributed, and documented. So, early facial recognition research was really cautious about the way that face data was collected, even for research purposes. They spent a lot of money. The Ferret initiative at the National Institute of Standards and Technology was sort of collected the first larger, face data set for facial recognition development and evaluation. This is on the order of thousands of face images. They would pay for photographers to take images of models that provided consent. They would think a lot about how they would store that data. They would think a lot about data distribution. They were very conscious of these dimensions of how to treat this information. And then we sort of entered this era of people pulling these data sets from the internet. The big kind of turning point, there were a couple turning points. One was a data set called Labeled Faces in the Wild, where suddenly a set of researchers had recognized oh, well, people are uploading, we have images of celebrities that are uploaded on the internet. We have images of the faces of, individuals from social media profiles. And we can scrape this information and we can make this into a data set that's much larger than the data sets we've been working on before. And that might improve our performance on these facial recognition tasks. And so that was a turning point in terms of how people saw face data, because suddenly it wasn't this thing that you had to be really careful about how you collected and curated. It was just something that was available on the web. And so they started with celebrity faces, and this Label Faces in the Wild data set was really a turning point with respect to that. But then there's this sort of deep face model that Facebook, of all companies, released in 2019. And that was sort of the beginning of a very, 2014. And that was the beginning of sort of what we call the deep learning breakthrough period, where in 2012, AlexNet was sort of this revolution in the deep learning space, where people realized that if you had a lot of data, you could get really accurate models. And then by 2014, Facebook realized hey, we have a lot of face data. And they are very explicit about this. This is an era of no shame. So they're very explicit about it in their data, in their papers around this, where they talk about the fact that they take face image data from profiles, Facebook profiles, and they decide that they can train the most accurate facial recognition, facial analysis model based off of these images of their users. And they do that, and they kind of beat the state-of-the-art performance on the Label Faces in the Wild data set. And that also kind of introduces a whole nother, and it's really interesting because, now Facebook is being sued for some of the ways in which they violate, the privacy of their users, especially with respect to face data, and which is now acknowledged to be biometric data. You might have noticed that they don't necessarily do the auto detection around an auto identification in when you upload a Facebook image, and that's all because of a lot of the like litigation that has surrounded the way in which they've thought about and handled facial recognition for years. And so Facebook has, gone through their own journey with this, but it's fascinating to sort of see the role that they played and how we thought about that kind of data. And so, yeah, following this sort of like 2014 deep face model, it became very normalized for people to say, okay, I'm just going to go on the internet and collect as many faces as possible. And the rationale was sort of like, oh, if I use faces of public figures and celebrities, then, that's fine. But then IBM, has their diversity in faces data set where they just take faces from Flickr. And so, we've sort of seen the sort of gradual decline of sensitivity to the reality of the fact that, oh no, you're actually dealing with biometric data. This is the same as, storing a huge database of fingerprints. And I think the other dimension of this that we're discovering now is that, these data sets are not necessarily representative or even vetted to think about things such as representation. Even though, once you have the model is sort of disproportionately deployed on, impacted and marginalized populations. So there was that huge discrepancy in terms of who it's trained on and who it's deployed on. Also got even like less properly recorded and less monitored as these data sets became larger and larger and just less and less manageable. So that was really what we traced in that paper. And like I said, this has led to a lot of follow-up work, and I've been very involved in attempting to improve the data practices in the field as a whole, imposing documentation requirements for publication at big conferences like NeurIPS, but also, on the policy front, really advocating for monitoring this data's use, tracking and having oversight over the collection of these data sets. It's a risk to have, these really large data sets of millions of faces. Like that in itself is a huge sort of privacy risk. And so, thinking through this in the policy realm has also been really critical as well. But that was we kind of try to tell the whole story of how we went from being aware of the privacy, consent, and sort of demographic considerations to completely disregarding all of this in the deep learning era.
Yeah, and I think that that's such a critical point in part because of the point you made about, this happened at the same time as the development and the deployment of these tools is happening right in practice in the world, and in particular for law enforcement, right? Yeah. So one of the other kind of themes of the kind of the conclusion of that paper, right, is this came from law enforcement and went to law enforcement, right? Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like what you saw in the historical record of the historiography of law enforcement.
Yeah. So a lot of the motivation for facial recognition as a task came from attempting to identify suspects. Like the purpose was meant to it was meant to always sort of play this role in law enforcement. Something else that we found in our sort of like overview of the data sets across the years was that in the later years, in the deep learning era, especially as these companies attempted to commercialize this technology, they would reframe the task. So they would say like, oh, this is not just about, identification, or, this is not just about attempting to sort of, probe for, similarity to, to a database of faces. This is also about facial analysis tasks, like, attempt like smile detection and other sort of like more benign facial analysis tasks. They would sort of attempt to commercialize it based off of that and sort of disguise the initial sort of origins of the tech, which was very much about, suspect identification and very grounded in criminal justice violations. And so I feel like that was also a really big lesson as well, was that even when they were conscious about some of these privacy, consent, and demographic issues, the motivation behind the use of the technology was always around how can we leverage this as a tool to identify suspects in the criminal justice space and also in immigration. We talk about the role of the facial recognition vendors test by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and also like the precursor to that, which was the Ferret initiative, and how much the government, the US government, invested in sort of kickstarting. They had put in $6.4 million to sort of kickstart interest from like the research community into facial recognition research specifically, because they prioritized it for their purposes. So that was a big realization for us as well, of like how much that objective of, you know, applications of surveillance and applications of, you know, detecting criminality or detecting suspects was at the core of what motivated the development of the technology, even from the research angle. You know, the researchers that were working on it because of government financed incentives to push forward applications that were connected to their goals.
Absolutely. And so, you know, one of the things you've already spoken a little bit about is this 2020 moratorium on 3 of the major companies with access to technology for this purpose, right? IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft announced in the kind of heat of the moment of a series of racial justice protests and a lot of advocacy from folks like you and other colleagues you work with, right, to kind of document the particular risks and harms. You know, what did that how did that advocacy unfold? And then I think the other set of questions I have is what's happening in the face of that moratorium, right? We know that there's still a Government Accountability Office report that was released in the fall saying that 7 federal agencies are using facial recognition technology still, right? And I think there's some other stuff about, you know, police agencies across the country are still using other software. So I wonder if we could talk about those, the dynamics of the lead up to that moratorium. Exactly. And then kind of where we are now taking stock.
Yeah, it was really funny because I was just talking to a friend about this, and I was mentioning, like, you know, with every audit project, every evaluation we do of any kind of deployed algorithmic system, because you're sort of critiquing a company's product. I say, like, the companies sort of go through like the, you know, the 5 stages of corporate grief. Like, you know, they start off with denial. They say, oh no, that's not the result. And then it gets replicated enough times and it's like, okay, we'll accept it. But, you know, like, you know, they become angry and they become a bit hostile. And then, you know, and then you can see that they kind of go through the dip and then they end up in acceptance. And so that's exactly what happened with that project. You know, I remember, you know, some companies have different cultures. So, you know, Microsoft, and IBM, you know, immediately internally replicated our results, and then, you know, within a few months, try to re-release products, and then they faced sort of internal and external pushback that allowed them to sort of make that decision to pull out of that facial recognition market. A company like Amazon had like a different journey where they were pretty hostile towards us. I don't know if folks remember this, but they kind of went after me and Joy personally. They tried to discredit us and discredit our work. You know, thank goodness we published that paper in like a peer-reviewed venue, and other researchers as well as government regulators were able to replicate our findings at the time. And so there was like ample enough evidence to shield us from these accusations, but it was a pretty terrifying experience. You know, we're getting personal emails from like the general manager of that team, just being really angry about everything. And then eventually they kind of came to accept the result, right? And so now they fund an NSF grant on fairness. You know, they've hired a pretty big fairness team to think about these issues, et cetera. And so they came around eventually, but it was in the moment a bit of a scary experience. And I think something people don't always realize as well is it took us about 2.5 years to go from, you know, the publication of our results to them deciding to take a moratorium stance to not sell that technology to the police. So I think one of the reasons why especially Amazon was incredibly aggressive to us was because they had police clients in the pipeline. And our study kind of brought attention to that and how inappropriate it was for them to be selling this technology to police departments and to immigration like to ICE, given the fact that it was so dysfunctional on these minority, populations. And so I think that it really just messed with their their sales pitch at the time. And also like some shareholders, there was some shareholder advocacy at the time as well of shareholders pushing back against Amazon's sale of facial recognition to police, and then feeling some shareholder pressure on this topic. And then that combined with sort of the climate in 2020, things just sort of escalated to the point where they couldn't, they had to take action. And so what they did at first was sort of this 1-year moratorium of the sale of their facial recognition product to police. And then eventually, this was 2020 to 2021. At the end of 2021, they said that they would extend the moratorium indefinitely. IBM completely pulled out of the market. They don't have a publicly accessible facial recognition product at all anymore, which is really interesting. And I know that there was a lot of internal advocacy after our audit within IBM to push them out of that market. And so, that was interesting to see, but we don't know if they're like signing contracts, with companies and sort of privately giving access to those services, but there's nothing that's sort of publicly accessible or publicly visible. And then Microsoft also sort of committed to not selling to police. But I think something to note is that these were all voluntary commitments. And so there's no external imposition. And so they could completely do whatever they wanted to do after a period of time. In fact, I think one of the interesting things about voluntary commitments is that they make statements that they can then sort of create their own loopholes for. So Amazon, for example, said, we will set a moratorium on the sale of this particular facial recognition product, which was what we had audited, the sort of facial recognition API product. We are going to not sell or pitch this product to police clients. But then, they had this Amazon Ring sort of smart doorbell product. And that smart doorbell had a camera, and they integrated their facial recognition technology into the analysis of the camera footage from these smart doorbells, and then signed contracts with, at this point, it's, I think it's almost like 1,300 police departments across the country. And so those police departments have access to footage from these smart doorbells, and that footage is processed with facial recognition technology that they had previously made available through their API product. And so what is the difference between that and, them not offering this facial recognition model to police directly? And so there's some of these loopholes that we're seeing today that we couldn't have predicted back then. Same with Microsoft. They've like begun funding these facial recognition startups in various foreign, environments, and so and channeling their technology to be distributed through these startups that they own. And again, it's not Microsoft's product that they're selling to police, and so technically they're not breaching their own sort of self-created rule, but clearly there's a loophole that they're able to go through. And so I think that that's sort of been a lot of the fight after these commitments were made, is that we translated a lot of that effort into policy advocacy. So like I mentioned, that summer of 2019, we just saw a wave of sort of municipal moratoriums and facial recognition bans. So, like Berkeley has one and other places. Actually, there's some weird loopholes happening on that front as well. I was recently working on a case where because let's say there's 2 cities that have one has a facial recognition ban and the other one does not. There were police officers in the city with a facial recognition ban that would send their probe images to police departments in the city without that facial recognition ban, so that those police officers, those officers would scan those images and then send back the results, which is ridiculous. And so people are always trying to circumvent these rules, and it's incredibly difficult to sort of keep track of. But I do think a lot of those moratoriums and bans are still standing. And most importantly, some of the really big policy developments, I'm thinking of Washington and some other spaces where they really pushed up against, in Washington, they were really pushing up against, Microsoft lobbyists, for example. In some of these states where they had, really tough fights and were able to get something, a lot of that policy still is incredibly useful in forcing these companies to be more transparent about who they're selling this technology to, what kind of testing that they do on this technology before they release it. So it's like minimizing the amount of like junk technology in the field and in the space. And then it's also sort of requiring better distribution practices around face data and better data management practices, like sort of re-acknowledging the role of face data as biometrics. So we have seen a little bit of progress, but we're still very far from like, the national facial recognition privacy bill we're hoping for. But we have sort of had these like statewide wins, and we've had some of these municipal wins that I think will hopefully bubble up into something more comprehensive. But yeah, I am a firm believer of like self-regulation does not work after experiencing these sort of voluntary commitments kind of break down when it came down to it.
Absolutely. And I think I just dropped in the chat, there was an announcement at the end of last month that Amazon is no longer going to let law enforcement directly request without a warrant getting access to some of that Ring footage that like each loophole can sometimes then get the pushback but then you're right that then there can be new loopholes that are created, and right there are kind of like evolving fronts in this tech, and the tech is moving faster than policy, right? I think is a clear thing that's happening. I think that's also a real lesson from that history you unfurled in the About Face paper, right?
Yeah. But I will say, the tech is moving pretty quickly, because we're hearing that about generative AI and a lot of things today. But it's like, we can also innovate in terms of how we set up policy and how we think through policy. Like, with the facial recognition work, we worked a lot with ACLU, and specifically like ACLU Massachusetts, and Fight for the Future, which, they're incredible. They're incredible partners in that. Actually, Fight for the Future has this incredible map of all the current facial recognition legislation. I think they have a website called banfacialrecognition.com where they just lay everything out. And so it helped with tracking, but they also did a lot of on the ground campaigning work. And I thought the most impressive thing about ACLU's approach was they had this sort of like COPS template. So they created a sort of memo / like legislative template that they would give to different municipalities, and they would make available on their website, where if you wanted to set up a facial recognition ban or moratorium, you had all the details already presented to you, and you just had to kind of like adjust it to your particular city. And they purposefully targeted municipal councils because it was easy and it was quick. And then once enough, once enough cities, especially big cities within a state, took this kind of action, that kind of bubbled up to statewide legislation, which is obviously a little slower. And then once enough states sort of started taking action, then then it became a national issue. So they had this very grassroots approach that I thought was a really innovative policy and advocacy strategy. And so I think about that a lot when reflecting on, what it means to regulate emerging tech in general and how to strategize around these things.
Yeah, and shout out to Cade Crockford at the ACLU of Massachusetts.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They lead a lot of the work here, and I just dropped the link to their campaign, like press pause on facial recognition, I think is what they've called it here in Massachusetts, where folks can see those resources that Deb just mentioned. One of the other things that it seems to me is a kind of unintended consequence potentially of having the kind of bigger players in the market who are maybe more susceptible to this kind of sort of publicly created transparency and to pushback is that in the kind of birth of their moratorium, that leaves a vacuum that then can be filled by other players who may not be as accountable to that kind of pushback. So I'm wondering if, I know I've seen some reporting about kind of smaller entities getting some of these law enforcement contracts. What are the kind of risks and trade-offs in that in terms of advocacy of what happens when companies that may be less scrupulous in accepting the need for there being a fairness team, right, end up filling in those contracts?
Yeah. So it's not, on one hand, it's the sort of small vendors as well, but there's some not so small vendors like Cognitech, NEC they're not small, but they're just not visible by the general population because they do a lot of business to business type transactions. And so, if someone was to see NEC, they would not be able to like recognize that name. And so, yeah, I think this is why we ended up pushing towards like industry-wide regulatory kind of guardrails as our main objective, rather than going after the particular named organizations in our audit. And this is, again, one of those limits of the audit that I reflect on in this sort of actionable auditing paper that we put out after the gender shades paper. We sort of have this follow-up reflection on the gender shades experience. And we named the fact that, with an audit, because you're naming audit targets, those audit targets get a lot of publicity, negative publicity, and they feel that public pressure to make these changes. But any of the companies that are not named explicitly, even if they're building the exact same product and they're operating in the exact same industry, often don't feel that same pressure and don't make any updates to their product or improvements to their product in response to the audit. And so that was a very disheartening realization, but it made us realize that the goal of these audits is not so much the individual corporate shaming and commitments, even though that is helpful. It is actually more about industry-wide changes, industry-wide restrictions, policy, regulatory advocacy, feeding it into campaigns, managed by civil society. I've actually very recently sort of just become more and more involved with civil society. I'm now working very closely with the Leadership Conference on civil and human rights, because they sort of have a coalition of different civil society orgs. And it's been very informative of just like trying to figure out how to do research that feeds into that kind of campaigning that leads to more material policy and regulatory outcomes, or even like what happened with NIST, where we wrote our paper and then it was cited in terms of redefining their standards on how they evaluate this type of technology. And that just changes the sort of research practice for the field, right? So we started aiming our work towards these audiences instead of trying to, go after individual bad guys, because that was just, incredibly difficult. I think the other thing that, we've begun to reflect on as well is like, how can our work feed into more kind of broader standards, and how do we make these audits effective involves like that public narrative and that public awareness. And so, in retrospect, it was a good choice to audit, Microsoft and IBM and Amazon because they were so publicly recognizable as names. I mean, we mentioned that in the actionable auditing paper as well. It's like, because they were so recognizable, and we named multiple of them and they all had the same problem, it made for like a appealing journalistic narrative, and that really helped the findings sort of go viral in a way and gain the attention of policymakers in the first place. And so trying to understand the relationship between, the kind of research we do, the public narratives about that research, and how to gain that attention of policymakers and regulators for more meaningful industry-wide change is something that we're continuously debating and discussing and strategizing about with any project that we're working on, starting with this one, really.
Yeah, that's very important kind of dialogue with a past self too, to figure out where did we get to with this research and how can we move forward to the next phase.
For sure. Yeah. I will say a minor point too about the smaller vendors as well is that, because of the impact of our work on NIST and the role that NIST plays in procurement, you were mentioning the GAO report on facial recognition use by the government.
Yeah.
They rely on NIST standard outcome, evaluation outcomes as part of their procurement process. And it's in a lot of cases mandated for them to consider performance on NIST evaluations as part of that. And so when our work kind of forced NIST to evaluate things looking at the demographic effects, it also shaped the procurement processes at various of these agencies that were looking to procure facial recognition services. So whether it was coming from a startup or an unrecognizable name or a recognizable name, it did shift the evaluation standards that they were being assessed against. And I think that also maybe did a good job filtering out some of the really, really horrible candidates. And so that's another kind of strategy we're reflecting on now is these procurement processes. The Office of Management and Budget has put out a lot of guidelines thinking about what that means in this age of AI and facial recognition technology. How do we think about our assessment of what it means to procure these things? And that's another way to just control the quality of these models.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I did drop the link to the GAO report in the chat if
Yeah.
folks want to take a look at it. And I think that, this kind of leads into another set of questions. And then I will pause maybe after this last question, and folks can jump in with their own questions in the chat. But part of what we are seeing happen in the law enforcement space, right, is that we have a massive increase in video surveillance all over, particularly in urban centers, that enable and incentivize law enforcement to be able to process hours and hours of footage, potentially, if they're looking for a particular suspect quickly, and to do it in the way that will feel most accurate as possible. And we know from kind of wrongful conviction cases and other issues that misidentification by eyewitnesses can have a very high error rate. And also there can be issues of bias and demographic bias in that, right? Cross-racial identification is not nearly as reliable. So, one of the things that I think law enforcement is looking for in this is, right, with this proliferation of video surveillance, which we know also that cameras are disproportionately kind of installed in communities of color, there is a risk of kind of compounding error, but also a risk that in the absence of something that feels objective and technologically sound, right, that officers are going to sort of mine the existing databases of mugshots and gang databases, right, and use that and to make an identification in cases. So I wonder if you could talk about those kind of competing equity concerns as we move into the sort of brave new world of video surveillance.
Oh my Lord, that was such a loaded question.
I'm so sorry. You're right, it is.
I love that last line, brave new world of video surveillance. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's terrifying, but so true. Yeah, I think there's a couple points to pull out from that whole narrative you just shared. Like, one is the physical surveillance infrastructure is really shocking. There's a great New York Times article about like the prevalence of surveillance footage throughout the city, especially post 9/11, where there's just cameras everywhere. I think in the article, they like trace an individual as he's walking through like a park, and he doesn't know, and they don't know who he is, and then they're able to identify him based off of just like going into the footage of various cameras around the park, and so the physical infrastructure for surveillance is really intense, but also the digital infrastructure for surveillance is really intense as well. There's been a lot of work on like the way that ICE leverages digital surveillance. So they'll track young kids on like online platforms, and suspect them, put them in gang databases based off of online activity, and they'll trace all of that, leveraging facial recognition to track profiles based off of like, profile images and things like that, and posts. And so the infrastructure enabling the surveillance apparatus is really shocking when you get into it. And I think, like you mentioned, the availability of this kind of data is in itself a problem in an unregulated space. I think one big challenge, or one thing that personally disturbs me, is how easy it is to distribute, especially between police departments, between different stakeholders. Like, there's not a lot of clear regulation. There are some states that are really clamping down on it, but there's not a lot of clear regulation on how this data is controlled, and that is obviously a really huge privacy violation. I'll also say, to your point around that tension of the consequences of asking. So I guess also to clarify, the question is it around the consequences of asking for a more diverse data set, or are you trying to maybe get at a deeper question?
Well, I think it's both, right? Like, asking for a more diverse data set then gives gives law enforcement the authority then to use that data set, right? But also, in the absence of a data set, right, during the moratorium, then they're going to use their existing data, which might be just the stream of faces that have already been arrested, whether those arrests result in convictions or not, right? And those, we know from data across the criminal punishment system, right, that those faces are more likely to be Black and brown disproportionately.
Yeah, I get that. So this is reminding me of like some of the cases that were put up against Clearview AI, where for those that don't know, Clearview AI sort of leveraged social media data in order to identify individuals. So like, people's Instagram posts and Facebook posts to sort of supplement the image databases that already existed, from like, you know, immigration databases to you know, police records and these suspect mugshot databases. Yeah, I think the argument that had been made was like, well, isn't this more equitable than relying on the data that's already there? I think a couple things, right, is like, one is this conversation around, you know, this is biometric data. It happens to be uploaded on the internet, but there is a sensitivity to it because it is personally identifiable, you know, based off of this image. And so there should be way more control in terms of how much you can grab and how much you can hold on to, but also how you distribute and how you share. The mugshot databases and suspect databases, there is like an awareness to some degree of those that are in there. Like, in order for them to collect that information, there's sort of a mutual awareness from the, you know, from the subject that's in there, and the police department. And again, you know, their consent's a little forced, you know, you don't really have a choice. But the management of those databases and the you know, the awareness of the subject is much higher than these other alternative databases where they just pull people off the internet. Another example of this was really in response to our audit. Initially, IBM created their diversity in faces data set, where they just pulled images off of Flickr. And those data subjects were very surprised to find themselves in this facial recognition. You don't upload a photo to Flickr with the aspiration of being included in a facial recognition data set. NBC has a really good investigation on this called, you know, facial recognition's dirty little secret or something like that. And so, you know, I think for me, it's the awareness aspect makes the sort of publicly collected data sets much worse. And the diversity kind of justification for that doesn't hold as a viable rationale. I think the other aspect as well is that, me and Joy have also kind of critiqued the fact that if it's if you need to sort of exploit people's data without their awareness or consent in order for you to get a more diverse data set, then maybe this is not like an appropriate technology to use in this context. Like, maybe the like mechanisms through which you can obtain the data that you need to build the type of technology that's going to function for all the populations that are going to be impacted is just not there. If you have to sort of kind of reduce yourself to these like underhanded approaches to get the kind of data you need to get this technology to work. And so that was an argument that we had in many policy roundtables as well, of, you know, if someone is inappropriately collecting data in order to diversify their data set, then they don't have a diverse data set, and their technology is actually inadequate and inappropriately developed. And so I think that was a, you know, a harder sell, obviously, for the vendors to accept, but it still remains sort of my stance on this is, yeah, if you can't approach things more considerately, then you have a problem. I also think, like, you know, with the mugshots, because you made an interesting point of sometimes these mugshots are more diverse than that social media data, and, you know, it's kind of strange that we don't really rely on these mugshots for these models, and, you know, it's strange that it's underperforming for these darker skinned individuals versus not. I think there's a lot of complexity to that observation. But I think, you know, one thing I reflect on a lot is, you know, thinking about who builds these data sets and who has who builds these models and who has access to these models versus who uses these models. So, you know, like I mentioned, you know, a lot of the police departments make use of the model. So the test set is, you know, these more diverse mugshot data set ecosystems. But in terms of who develops these models, you rarely actually have, you know, corporations that have access to that kind of data developing these models. I mean, even the National Institute of Standards and Technology, like, they are purely on the evaluation side, and they do have benchmarks that are mugshot based and based off of immigration faces through immigration processes, and those are more diverse than anything else that was out there at the time. And we mentioned that in our about face paper as well. But yeah, like, those that develop these models actually don't have that kind of access. And so they just grab faces from wherever they can find it, which tends to be the internet, and they don't track demographic data, and so they don't think about it, and that ends up leading to some of the technology that is incredibly underperforming for the population that it's disproportionately deployed on. So yeah, a horrible setup that we have, but it's kind of responsible for that dynamic that we see. So yeah, I don't think there's as much of a risk that the mugshots will be leveraged in training. Hopefully there will be laws to really protect those people that, if you have your face uploaded for a mugshot, you're not expecting to be part of a training set, and there should be protections against, how your information, your biometric information is used. But yeah, I think the current thing preventing that from actually practically happening is the fact that the developers and the users are actually quite separate populations.
Thank you for all of that. We've got about 15 minutes left and lots of questions in the chat. So I'm going to call on people in the order in which the questions came in. But if you have other questions, feel free to add them to the chat or raise a hand. The first question I'm seeing is from Sherry Neeson Jordan. Sherry, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks for the opportunity. So you've talked a lot about the American companies. I'm actually Canadian, but I sit on the police commission, so I'm very interested in this particular area. And I'm concerned about international companies that you probably know lots about. And can you comment a little bit on their use and their intervention into other countries?
Yeah, I was gonna say I am also Canadian, actually. It's so lovely to see a fellow Canadian here. I was gonna mention the privacy commissioner in Canada actually was one of the first to really put out a truly clear statement about Clearview AI, pun not intended. But yeah, like, they're one of the first to really denounce the use of public face data for technology. And so, I do think that, and now, Carly Kine is the privacy commissioner in Australia and has been very, she just started, but she's very proactive about advocating against Clearview. And the US was sort of a bit delayed, but they're now beginning to be more vocal in their critique of Clearview AI's use of public face data. And so I do think internationally the conversation has actually already always been a step ahead of the US when it comes to this. I'll also mention the EU in general, because of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, has always taken like a data protection first approach to AI regulation. And I think that's really helped with these facial recognition cases. So some people might have been following the EU AI Act and the developments around that recently. Debates on that really concluded literally last month after like hours and hours of debate and chaos. And in the initial drafts of that act was actually a lot of mention of facial recognition. In the final draft, they actually banned the use of facial recognition in various contexts, including emotion recognition, the use of facial recognition in sort of for minors, and especially in education settings. There was a lot of school surveillance cases that they referenced in there. And so I do think internationally the conversation has actually been a little bit more mature, just because the state of privacy legislation internationally, it happens to be a little bit more mature than what we see in the US currently. Like the US, we still don't have comprehensive, federal level privacy laws. But in other countries, something like that does exist, and it makes it easier to set these boundaries around, data usage, making use of data in a way that violates the, informed consent of the subject, the data subject. And so I feel like there are some states where, things are happening in the state and in the US. So like California's Privacy Act is pretty strong, and people are really relying on that. And then BIPA, which, is another piece of legislation that I think people are really, that's where a lot of the lawsuits against Facebook's use of face data has really come out of these states. But yeah, I think internationally, things have actually been going pretty well. When it comes to the companies involved, a lot of these companies operate internationally. So NEC and Cognitech, which are sort of the companies that are like not publicly known, but are sort of the big operators, the silent operators. They operate internationally, even though they have a lot of US government clients. They also have other governments as clients. And like Clearview AI operates internationally. Microsoft, they sell their facial recognition products to Israel and other countries. And so like there has been quite a few of these companies actually operate internationally. Yeah. I'm trying to think of like a company that's maybe based internationally that's been a problem sort of outside of scope. I know so Big Brother UK is a group that operates in the UK, and they've been going after the Metropolitan Police use of and their use of facial recognition. And if you're interested in sort of international cases, that might be something to look into. I know Gina Neff, who's now at the University of Cambridge, has done a lot of audit work on the facial recognition products that the Metropolitan Police has been caught using. And so that might also be another international case worth reflecting on. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think because a lot of our audit work kind of gained visibility in the States more. We've been sort of engaged in that campaign work more, but I think there's a lot of international kind of side effects to that that's worth reflecting on. I think something we realized was like our work actually really impacted the facial recognition market in China. So one of the companies that we audited in the first study was Face++, which was a subsidiary of a Chinese company called MegV. And they had developed a facial recognition product that also failed for darker skinned female faces. And we didn't realize because we couldn't read the articles, but it became a huge press moment in China. And so a bunch of the Chinese facial recognition companies, one that I'm thinking of right now is CloudWalk, which is another big Chinese facial recognition company. Facial recognition is a huge part of sort of the Chinese AI, industry. And so, they had their own kind of moment. We weren't really as much participating in that, but we became aware a couple of years later that they had their own moment and of addressing, bias issues in facial recognition in response to the study. And so maybe, in the future, we can definitely kind of go back to that and track that a little bit better.
Thanks.
Thank you. So next up, we've got Lloyd McDonald. Lloyd, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. What's the reason that in the early years that there was less reliability with the operation of the facial recognition technology with minority women? Mm-hmm. And has there been any significant improvement in the reliability of the technology with regard to minority women?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're not exactly sure. We can't claim with full certainty, but a huge sort of hypothesis, or sort of the dominant hypothesis for why these failures happened in the first place was because of something, and we mentioned in the actionable auditing paper, called benchmark bias, where effectively the sort of default, if you scrape the web, this is also, again, like 2017, 2018, the conversation around bias and fairness in the machine learning space was severely underdeveloped. And so if you would go to Google and search something like doctor, it's not the case now because Google has a fairness team and they worked on this problem, been called out about it. But if you went to Google at the time and you search something like doctor, it would show you sort of all, like all men and lighter skinned men. Or if you searched up beautiful skin, you would see all lighter skinned women. Like they just had an issue where the referenced images, the default search image results were sort of based off of mainstream media representations of these concepts or advertising media representation of these concepts. And so that has an inherent sort of like social bias or socially informed bias. And so in the case of, face data, especially in this sort of deep learning era where a lot of that face data was collected from the internet, it wasn't thoughtfully sourced, with consent and a photographer and participants, but it was just pulled from what was freely available on the internet. We saw that the demographics of the subjects in these face data sets shifted dramatically towards being, more disproportionately male and more disproportionately lighter skinned individuals because of the media bias around, and also, we also looked at other dimensions like age. There's a paper we have called Saving Face where we analyze other attributes such as age and the age distribution. It tends to be like more like, young to like middle-aged individuals, because that's who, we have face data, who uploads who's sort of disproportionately represented in on the internet, on internet images of faces. And so that was really what led to a lot of the internet scraped data sets in those early days being kind of demographically skewed. And also no one was tracking it at the time. No one was thinking about the demographics of these subjects. And so we kind of mindlessly collected that information without really reflecting and critiquing on who was represented. And I think the more critical issue was not only was that the training data, but they would take maybe 10% of that data set and use it as the test data. And so for a really long time, they were like, oh, our models are performing really well on, the images that we've collected, but not recognizing that the images that were collected were not representative of, segments of this impacted population. So the big innovation of gender shades, this is in the original gender shades paper. It's also, the diversity in faces paper that the IBM folks wrote. They actually break down all the mainstream facial recognition benchmarks and data sets at the time. And they actually show like, oh, this data set has like 94% male subjects and 77% lighter skin subjects. If I had a screen I could share and just show you, but they had sort of a breakdown of the demographics for all the major face recognition data sets and benchmarks at the time. And then they put the pilot Parliament's benchmark, which was the benchmark that we had developed for gender shades. And our benchmark was the only one that was sort of balanced because we had intentionally curated that benchmark to be more representative between, darker and lighter skin. So that benchmark that we had developed was the only one that was sort of balanced in terms of representation of darker versus lighter skin subjects and male versus female subjects. And so I think just by virtue of
and has the technology improved since then, such that the skewing against the dark skin women no longer exists?
There's still a discrepancy, but it's much lower than it was before. So improvement on the performance for darker skinned women has increased dramatically because people are more conscious of the issue and curate better benchmarks and evaluate for that. But we still have a discrepancy. It's just not as bad as it was before. The NIST facial recognition vendors test has like, annual results, like they have like 2023 results. So you can probably see what the state of the art is right now. But the last time I checked, there was still a discrepancy. It just wasn't as wide as like 30%, which it was when we evaluated it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. And I think the next question up is from Katie Kinsey, I think. Are you still here and do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thanks for this presentation. I was just wanting to hear a little bit more how you think about the sort of privacy risks or other risks of face images as a biometric data. I think it's something I think about a lot, and it's not always intuitive to me. Like, what are the actual risks if my image, gets breached or other kinds of things? So how do you think about those risks as face images vis-a-vis biometric data?
Yeah, I was gonna say I really see it on par with like fingerprint data, and I wish more people understood it that way. Where I think people have an intuitive sense of like you wouldn't upload your fingerprint to the internet, but we feel comfortable doing that with our faces. And the fact that it can be captured remotely without awareness or consent is like an additional risk. And so I just feel like it's sort of like, in terms of its sensitivity, it's as sensitive as a fingerprint in the sense of the technology that we're at right now could easily identify someone based off of just their face. And and so it's sort of on par with that risk, but it's the way in which it's collected is sort of this passive collection, whereas with fingerprints, you know, it's very hard for, it's possible for someone to collect your fingerprint without your awareness or consent, but it's much harder for them. But yeah, like, so with faces, I find that it's like the risk is as high as something like your fingerprint being out there. But the risk is even made worse by how passively it can be collected and distributed. And so I think that that's sort of my intuition of like what that risk is. And so, you know, in the same way that we're very strict with people that have large databases of people's fingerprints, like, you know, police departments, et cetera, I think we should have an equal sort of wariness of those that have curated like large collections of faces and identities. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how I intuitively reflect on the risk, the privacy risk of face data.
Okay, so just to be respectful of your time, Deb, I know we did get started a little bit 5 minutes late. Do you have 5 more minutes if we've got a couple more questions?
Yeah,
if you don't
for
mind
sure.
sticking around.
Yeah.
Okay, because I know we've got people who are anxious to ask their questions. So the next one is up from Kay Greenberg. Kay, are you here and able to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I should scroll up and look at it, shouldn't I? So I guess you kind of alluded to this when you were talking about, can you talk a little bit about maybe how some of this facial data is being used for predictive policing? Is it being combined with like the databases and algorithms like for sentencing and for bail determinations that they've been rolling out? I guess, you know, a lot of my fears around this is how it's going to be used, you know,
Yeah.
also like in court.
Mm-hmm.
As something that is quote unquote more reliable than humans.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the criminal justice space, you know, I think there's like different types of facial recognition, right? So there's the facial recognition, which is just sort of confirming the identity of the face. So saying like, you know, is this person this other person? Like, is it, you know, sort of like a face similarity assessment? And then there's also the sort of probe of like 1 to n, where it's like, I have a face of a suspect. Can you try to identify like who this is similar to in my database of, you know, mugshots? And so, you know, we're seeing different types of applications from the aspect of like, I think most of the facial recognition applications, I don't know if you linked to, I think I saw Katie linked to Kashmir Hill's book, which is incredible, and goes into detail all the ways in which the technology is being used across various police departments. But I think in terms of where does it lie on this criminal justice pipeline, like it's very much around like arrests and informing arrests. I will say that there is like some facial analysis tools that attempt to assess something like criminality, and you know, strange things like that, and sometimes you know, come up with like risk scores associated or informed by face data. And so again, that is like deeply scientifically suspicious to me, but I know that there are people pitching that. And so you can imagine someone you know, leveraging that as some kind of input in their predictive policing software or whatever. But I don't think that's as common as you know, using the facial recognition technology as a mechanism to identify potential objects of arrest. I will say something that has been interesting to me has been how facial recognition technology gets used in other domains. So it gets used a lot, you know, for like surveillance at schools. It gets used a lot in immigration. It gets used a lot, you know, for workplace surveillance, you know, tracking people as they move around. During COVID, you know, there's a lot of facial recognition use for tracking individuals and compliance for stay at home. And so you can kind of see the ways in which, as a surveillance apparatus, it can just be used across various contexts. But in terms of like that criminal justice pipeline, I think it's sort of disproportionately just used as a point of identification for suspects. And it's not as common to see it in other parts of that pipeline. Like I haven't like encountered a lot of use of facial recognition in sentencing, for example. Though, like I said, you know, there are vendors that are pitching it for that.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more in our next session on March 6th too about this notion of predictive policing technology and how that's getting deployed and other kind of big data in policing overall. So our last question is going to be from Maya Morales. So Maya, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be fast. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm seeing in terms of law enforcement use and like worries about it is combination with like location data and predictive tools that are not necessarily just predictive, but also real time. And so I'm wondering if you've looked into that or if that's something that you're kind of just getting into or if you have any input on it.
Oh, you mean other types of technologies? I didn't quite catch the question.
Kind of the way that face rec may be able to be used with geolocating and other,
I see.
yeah,
I see.
and certainly
in
like, you know,
combination with, okay,
yeah,
okay.
and one of those ways might be other biometric
Yeah,
collections. So for instance,
yeah,
our police department has just put in a request to the DOJ for a rapid DNA machine.
yeah.
You know, how might this
Yeah.
yeah.
The combination of the technologies and how it causes a bigger and bigger mess. You're reminding me of a case I read recently of like shot spotter. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but sort of it's a type of technology that tries to predict if a particular sound is a gunshot, and then it directs police into that region. And so there have been people trying to create pipelines where like if shot spotter flags a particular region, they'll access the surveillance footage, capture face data, and attempt to identify suspects preemptively, which I'm like, there's a lot of dimensions of questions there of like, how that could lead to a lot of, false assumptions and false arrests, especially given the error rate of technology like ShotSpotter. And so there are some of those kind of combo situations that we're seeing. I think also, also in relation to Sherry's earlier question as well, or Kay's earlier question, sorry, where effectively like, a lot of what people use facial recognition for is for suspect identification, but the trigger through which they even get that initial suspect image or the probe to identify the suspect within their mug database, like the search image that they get can actually come from a bunch of different things. So sometimes, there's a really great article called Garbage In, Garbage Out that Georgetown Law has put together, where they talk about, the fact that there's all of these like grainy surveillance footage situations where, maybe a predictive policing technology will direct a police car towards a particular neighborhood, and they'll be driving around, and then they might suspect, oh, someone's running out of here, let's look at their grainy surveillance footage and put that in, and then just like harass whoever's there. There's also a lot of evidence of like, the suspect looked like this celebrity, let's use that as the probe image, or we have this sketch of a potential suspect and we're going to use that as the probe image. So there's a lot of ways in which this technology gets like misused and mishandled, and that even increases the lack of accuracy of who they end up flagging as suspects. And obviously then that leads to a lot of the false arrests. So I think a lot of the connection between these comes with the prompt for the suspect. And then also to your point around like DNA and like, how do they confirm the identity of these people? I'm thinking about a case that I was consulting on with like respect to immigration, where sometimes people will believe the face data more than they'll believe other pieces of evidence, because there was this particular case where someone was being harassed by ICE effectively and threatened of deportation. And their evidence was that, he didn't have the same name as the suspect. He didn't have the same social security number. Even his DNA profile like returned negative, but they had a facial recognition match. And so, for certain contexts, like, again, even though we are so casual with our face, it's like treated as like biometric evidence on par with a fingerprint, or even in some cases, depending on the error rate for the DNA technology that they're using, like a DNA sample. And so that becomes really, really scary, especially since this technology, is less effective for, darker skinned individuals and darker skinned women. And so that is sort of maybe how these things intersect in a more practical setting.
That was a brilliant tying together of threads to end us this evening. So thank you so much, Deb, for being here and for sharing your expertise with us. And this conversation was recorded. So if people want to go back and revisit all of the wonderful, highly technical things that Deb said, by all means, we will post the video. We will also try to share those resources that were dropped in the chat when we do post the video on our website. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to Deb for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.